Well, it's difficult to answer that question straightforwardly because so many movements, at least in Latin America, have used the term autonomy. As you well know, there are a lot of different meanings of the word autonomy. We kind of registered at least five meanings. One is a political one, where movements try to seek autonomy from political parties, from the state, in order to take decision and participate in decision making on their own terms. So that has been a constant in Latin America, and at least for the past 40 years, that struggle for autonomy, for political autonomy. The second one has been more, let's say, the economic autonomy, this idea of trying to build resources collectively in order to support the livelihood of small-scale producers or peasant producers. And that has been sort of sought by different meaning, by different ways, by maybe sometimes withdrawing from the market, finding ways to produce, to exchange around the market through reciprocity, redistribution, community resilience. And in other cases, it's been through the market by creating co-ops, organizations that try to get better prices or discounts on inputs, sell on markets. And other ones have been about creating markets also, different kinds of markets, short circuits, fair trade, etc. And those strategies, again, have been good or bad, depending on the correlation of forces between peasant movements and market actors, the state, etc. The other meaning has been extremely important in Latin America. It's been associated with the struggle for self-determination of indigenous people, or first people. And that is a much broader struggle for autonomy. It includes the political autonomy, the economic autonomy, by trying to control the territory over which they have historically been based, very often in negotiation with nation states to try to get some devolution of power, negotiating all kinds of new arrangement, institutional arrangement. And these struggle for autonomy have been around Latin America for many years, but at least since the 1990s, a lot of achievement have been made on those elements. Then, of course, there is surrounding all this a kind of utopia. Autonomy is an utopia, is an horizon, is an objective that a movement tried to reach by practicing a different kind of internal politics. And that is autonomy, and that is associated with a political practice. And in Latin America, it has been associated with assembly type of decision making, in consensus building, rotation of leaders, all kinds of practices that movement have been using, especially in the 1990s, starting in the 1990s, and then modifying them or reinventing them through the 2000s and all that. So those are the meanings of autonomy. But in terms of achievement and potential, the cases vary greatly. You can think of the Zapatista movement that has been very successful in getting control of a territory and establishing political institution over it, but it had not been very successful in reaching out to the rest of the Mexican society. In terms of autonomy, Nicaragua, the Atlantic coast, the people from the Atlantic coast that we analyze in our article through the work of Miguel Gonzalez, has been also extremely successful in obliging, to a certain degree, the Nicaraguan government to allow autonomy in that region where groups are in the Afro-descendant people and indigenous people take decision on their territory. There's all kinds of contradiction here also, again, advances and setbacks, but it basically really depends on how movements are able to organize coalitions with other movements, with other groups, with unions, with peasant movements when they're indigenous movement, with indigenous movement when they're peasant movement. And one of our findings in our collective article is that it has been very difficult throughout these 40 years of neoliberalism for movement to build a lasting coalition between movements that seek what we could say peasant autonomy through more political and economic measures, and those that seek indigenous or ethnic autonomy through the reconstitution of the nation state. Their struggle have sometimes merged, but very often they have departed, and they've not been able to really reach long-lasting alliances. And that has made the struggle for autonomy in Latin America very difficult. But it's something that constantly comes back to the fore, because it has been one of the ways that movement have sought to transform their societies and their communities.
Autonomy is a polysemic concept. No, there is no one definition of what autonomy means. Autonomy should be understood as the way different actors engaged in this specific autonomic politics and struggle define it. So as such, before we can even start to think what are the limits of potentiality, we have to first understand what we're talking about autonomy. And this definition can only be retrieved by the understanding that the actors attribute to it. So if there is this broader normative definition of autonomy as the capacity of collectivities to give themselves their own role, to live according, define their destinies and live according the way they decide collectively to do. What exactly this means will change in time and space. So the first thing when we think about autonomy, it's really to try to understand what we're talking about. Because these specific projects autonomy can only be defined and discussed based on these understandings attributed to the concept by the actors. And also these definitions are not endogenous. These definitions are always made in a broader context of a series of political and economic institutions, social relations, political practice, and so on. So these bring a very methodological complexity in the sense that we have necessarily to discuss the potential and limitations, adopt a relational approach, relating this broader idea of autonomy as capacity of political and social agency with specific definitions. So this make kind of, it implies a work of investigation, of research, before we can even start our analysis, to really based in different methodologies. It can be field work, interviews, but the first step, it's really try to understand what we're talking about in specific cases, in specific locations. And this also bring complexity, problematize the notion of autonomy, as in some traditions, it's simplistically defined as struggles that entail necessarily a threat from market or from the national state, a withdrawal from capitalist market and from the state. So, for instance, in the Bolivian case, since colonial time, both peasant and indigenous groups, movements, and organizations, in their understanding of autonomy, it's not a threat of these institutions. What they ask actually is a better inclusion in them. So when we adopt this relational approach, looking exactly what are the projects of the very same actors, these make difficult to make either or claim if a group is autonomous or not. In the understanding of Bolivian groups, it's the inclusion, it's not a threat, but in other spaces and in other times, it could be actually a threat. So also to think again, the limits and potentialities of the concept of autonomy, you have to problematize and complexify what we're talking about. And this leads to a second aspect that also make a concept that, although very useful to understand struggles, agrarian struggles in contemporary societies, but also historically, is the fact that autonomy is inherently a project that's never fully accomplished. So there is not such a thing as a totally autonomous or totally heteronomous subject. Autonomy is always a project. So you have to talk more about the degrees of autonomy, not an either or condition. And it is a project that's constantly, permanently in a co-constitutive but conflictive relation with its opposite, heteronomy. So while autonomy is one of the central imaginary institutions of modernity, since the Enlightenment, it was promised that modernity will bring to all human beings freedom, autonomy, and so on. The other institutions of modernity, state and market, pose a permanent threat of canceling this kind of freedom and what I understand by autonomy. So this tension between autonomy and heteronomy is always present in different degrees in autonomy struggles, not only for rural actors, but for any kind of collectivity. And this again make that the concept demand a more nuanced analysis. To wrap up, there is no way to answer what is the potential or the limits of autonomy, because first, autonomy is polysemic, so it depends what we're calling autonomy, and not us, but our actors that are involved in these struggles are calling autonomy, what are their projects autonomy. And second, is this project always in tension with heteronomy, therefore can be enhanced or hindered in different moments, and is never either or situation. So a straight answer, potential and limits, is always an open question.
To respond to your question by discussing a particular concept of autonomy that has, in my own terms, a biotechnical production-oriented core. And examples are the widely cited book, The New Peasantries by Jan Douwe van der Ploeg, and some literature on agroecology. These take autonomy as characterizing a way of farming, so far beyond autonomy as a political concept of social movements vis-à-vis the state and so on. Autonomy appears here as self-provisioning. The autonomous peasant constructs and maintains a self-controlled resource base in exchange with nature. So this concept of autonomy propagates withdrawal from input markets and reproduction of resources via non-commodity circuits. Well, this biotechnical production-oriented concept of peasant autonomy has some potential when it opens up agrarian studies for studying the labor process at the farm level. So it's about the politics of that farm level labor process. However, it has severe limitations in analytical terms. First, in this body of literature, peasant autonomy often appears as an ahistorical, decontextualized category. It does not matter where these peasants live and when they act, they are peasants because they struggle for autonomy as a universal feature of them. Of course, what you see in the literature at times, such a view of an intrinsic autonomous peasant is considered untenable and then softened with a lot of remarks that autonomy is relative. But the term relative autonomy is unsatisfactory, almost an oxymoron, something like alone together, or in this case, together alone. Relatively autonomous means in fact the same as relatively dependent. Whatever you use, the task remains to study the multiple ways in which capital shapes life in most places, rather than to think it away. And this brings me to my second limitation. The concept of autonomous peasant neglects important established insights on social differentiation, reproduction, and producer categories, such as simple commodity producers and semi-proletarians. And I think these are useful to understand the reproduction of the resource base and labor in relation to capital. And this links to a third limitation. The concept of autonomous peasant generally ignores accumulation from below and the existence of endogenous exploitation. Farmer accumulation strategies and competition fall outside the scope of peasant autonomy studies. Maybe because this would imply unpeasant-like strategies, such as competition coming from within. Well, some have argued that this outline of limitations is a structuralist and economistic identification of different positions in the agrarian structure. However, I would argue it is much more than that. It's based on observing local politics and subjectivities of farmers who express desires for accumulation, local feelings about poor versus rich, about entrepreneurship, about incorporating new inputs, about how to engage in relationships, in dependencies with other actors in the state, research, in the market, and so on. So recognizing such subjectivities could provide a more complete picture of smaller strategies, the lumping rural people together in a vague category of the autonomous peasant, opposing an external hyperstructure of dependencies. Well, to finish, now I recognize the political importance of struggles for autonomy by farmers and indigenous movements and the relevance of lowering inputs. I have problems with theories who use autonomy as a distinctive analytical category for characterizing the so-called peasantry.